You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Trump has finally hit a brick wall he can't talk his way around, based on an article by Thomas Kika. Trump's reality problem is a power problem. The case was never just about the pool. CNN frames this as Donald Trump hitting a brick wall because his story finally collapsed in court. That is too neat. The reflecting pool case is not mainly a tale about Trump running out of lies. It is a story about an administration manufacturing blame, then discovering that legal institutions still require evidence. The source says the cases tied to vandalism allegations at the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool were dropped, including charges against former Olympic canoeist David Hearn. It also says the underlying mess began with a costly renovation pushed by Trump, after which the pool was overrun with algae. That is the actual sequence: a bad decision, a public failure, and then an attempt to redirect responsibility downward. Power sat at the top. The decisive actor here was Trump. He pushed the renovation. He insisted the damage came from outside agitators. He used his own familiar technique of inventing a more flattering version of events and trying to make it politically mandatory. That matters because the article's framing risks making this sound like an abstract collision between reality and bluster. It was not abstract. Trump held the institutional advantage. He had the bully pulpit, the narrative machinery, and the ability to turn failure into accusation. The people lower down in the chain were left to absorb the consequences of a false story he had already sold. The power dynamic is the point. Trump does not merely lie. He uses the authority of office to force the rest of the system to spend time disproving his lies. G9 Pirro knew the limits. The source says Washington, D.C., U.S. District Attorney G9 Pirro's office dropped the cases, apparently recognizing it could not bluster its way through an actual court case. That is the institutional crack in the story. Pirro is not a neutral bystander. She is a law enforcement official operating inside Trump's orbit, and the source notes that she was in a dicier position than other officials who can repeat Trump's claims without having to test them in court. That is not accountability. It is exposure. Courts do not run on loyalty performances. They run on standards. Once the facts have to be proved instead of repeated, the Trump strategy starts losing oxygen. But the bigger lesson is uglier. The justice system appears to have been pushed into cleaning up after a political fabrication that should never have reached the level of criminal charges in the first place. If officials only retreat once a case becomes indefensible, the system is still being used as a stage for propaganda before it becomes a venue for justice. Blame was misdirected on purpose. The source is clear that the vandalism allegations appeared to stem from Trump's insistence that the pool's issues were caused by outside agitators. That wording matters because it shows the original accusation was not a neutral investigation. It was an effort to convert a failed renovation into a story about sabotage. That is a classic authoritarian move: create a mess, then point at an enemy. When the facts are embarrassing, blame invented enemies instead of a decision maker. When the consequence is public damage, hide it inside moral panic. When the embarrassment is obvious, demand that institutions repeat the fiction anyway. The people being cast as vandals were not the source of the failure. The source says the pool's problems follow the renovation pushed by Trump. Yet the political system still had to spend energy chasing a blame narrative that served his image. That is how power works when it is not checked early. It externalizes its failures and privatizes its responsibility. The numbers behind the myth. Collinson's broader point, as quoted in the source, is that Trump's alternative realities have long functioned as a political asset. They helped build his mystique and cover his failures. But the same article also gives the numbers that puncture the mythology. Trump's approval is at 34% in the CNN/SSRS poll, and roughly 2/3 of respondents say his policies have worsened economic conditions. That is not just bad branding. It is evidence that the political spell is wearing thin. The source notes that Trump can still talk up weak data, foreign policy setbacks, or even a failed renovation as if he were pitching property. But the country is not a prospectus, and people paying for groceries and rent are not buying the performance anymore. The point is not that Trump has lost all control of the narrative. It is that his narrative is increasingly expensive for everyone else to maintain. What this reveals: the reflecting pool episode is not about one foolish renovation or one imploding criminal case. It is about a political order that lets power move first and truth arrive later, if at all. Trump creates the failure. Loyalists seek a cover story. Institutions wobble until forced to admit the cover story will not survive scrutiny. That is the pattern. Authoritarian politics turns governance into image management and converts public damage into blame management. The law is then asked not to restrain power, but to launder it. When that laundering fails, the system is said to have hit a brick wall. The deeper reality is worse. The wall was there all along. The question is why so many institutions were willing to pretend it was not. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Alternet for today's article. With the automated voice of Sam, thanks for listening.